Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
It's good to see everybody here tonight. So we begin, as we so often do, with a question. A question this time taken directly from the parasha. Why the plagues? I don't mean individually why each plague. That's a whole nother conversation and one I'm happy to have any time. But why plagues at all? Why did God redeem us with violence and destruction? Why not simply start off with the plague of darkness, 3 days, and let the Israelites creep out and disappear in the night? Bada bing, bada boom, we're out, no more slaves, and no one has to get hurt. Not a bad idea, right? I mean, we know God can do the plague of darkness. We know that it can last for so many days. You know, people couldn't have noticed us leaving. And they would have just, when the lights came back on, oh, all the Israelites are gone. Oh no, where do they go? Problem solved. No, we don't even need a confrontation with Pharaoh. Just, everybody be ready on this night, and we'll get a 3-day head start, and they won't even know what direction we went in. Why not? Why? Was violence necessary? Is God okay with violence? Well, yes. Why might it be necessary?
Make a point.
To make a point to whom?
To those who would seek to harm the Israelites.
All right, so objective number one, violence was needed in order to show the Egyptians that violence was available should they continue to persist in that behavior. That, cease and desist doesn't mean much if it's not backed up by some ultimate red line. If you just say stop, or I'll say stop again, most people who are most inclined to do the worst behaviors are not going to stop. Just because you said stop.
Don't doesn't work.
Well, it works for a lot of situations, and certainly we would never jump to violence. That should not be the first response. And indeed, we see this laid out very clearly in the pattern of the plagues. The violence is not the first recourse. God sends Moses and says, ask. Moses asks. And they say no. And then Moses does the whole stick into a snake thing. And they say no. And then we do the blood, which, is a kind of creepy and inconvenient thing, but it doesn't hurt anyone. And slowly and slowly and slowly do the plagues escalate. But it doesn't go to the nuclear option from day one.
But you said they say no, but it also says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart.
You often misunderstood passage because of the way that sounds in English. Most of our commentators do not say that God made Pharaoh do anything other than what Pharaoh wanted to do in the first place. And indeed, we see throughout, especially the early days of the plagues, that it is Pharaoh who hardens his own heart. The same language is used, but with the verb conjugation being that Pharaoh is doing the hardening of himself. The phrase would probably be better rendered in English as stiffen your resolve. Hardening your heart has a certain connotation in modern English of being callous and being unfeeling. It was more likely the Shakespearean screw your courage to the sticking point of being brave. Really, it would seem the best explanation is that when God did intervene, it was to give Pharaoh courage. It was not to force him to do something wrong. It was giving him the strength to do what he wanted to do, which was unfortunately bad. But God did want to make a point, but not only to the Egyptians. Who else witnessed the use of violence? The Israelites. The Israelites also needed to understand that under the proper circumstances, violence would be an acceptable and sometimes unavoidable necessity. That when they came into the land of Canaan, even before then, they would encounter the armies of other peoples that would not look so kindly upon their presence. And those armies were not going to stop when you said don't. They were only going to stop if you could fight back, to the point that they would no longer be willing to risk the lives of themselves to try and take your life. And indeed, we know that this was a great concern of God, because we took the long route to Israel because of it. We could have gone the coastal road, which is a very short walk between Egypt and the land of Canaan, But that would have taken us immediately into the Philistine zone, and the Philistines at that particular time, that area was populated by a highly organized militant city-state system, and there would have been a lot of rough fighting. Now, we might have won, because, God on our side and all of that helps a great deal. Ultimate force multiplier, as they say. But we would have still needed the courage to actually go out to battle against what would have seemed overwhelming odds. And having been slaves at that point for hundreds of years, we were disinclined to believe in our own strength. And thus, probably, that wouldn't have been a good idea. Well, I say probably. God didn't think it would be a good idea, and who am I to second guess God? So God took us the long route so we would have more time to experience microdosing of the necessity of violence and our ability to use violence when needed in order to defend ourselves and show to ourselves that we had that strength. You see, this is the part that is very uncomfortable for most of us in the modern world, especially now in the 21st century, because we have been duly educated by Torah, by rabbinic literature, and by the Siddur itself to seek peace, to seek ways of reconciliation that don't involve a fist to someone else's face, that we shudder at the thought of using violence. And we should. But we should also recognize that, especially for our ancestors at that moment in history, they needed to use violence to stiffen their resolve, to harden their hearts, to use the term again, to recognize that they had the capacity to be strong in the face of adversity, so that they would be able to overcome all of the adversity they would eventually face. But violence is, pardon the expression, a double-edged sword, because violence very often can become a means to itself rather than a means to an end. When God is using violence in the plagues, and when we are using violence to fight off the attacking armies and such, it is because there is a vision ultimately of peace. There is a vision ultimately of being settled and secure and of not having to fight anyone, as exemplified by the later prophets that talk about beating our swords into plowshares. That is the ultimate goal, is that we don't have violence, that we will not study war anymore. And that needs to always be maintained, because if we believe that violence is good in and of itself, and that to be a fully realized human is to be able to wield violence whether it's needed or not, then we are missing the point. And unfortunately, many individuals, many cultures sometimes, begin to glorify violence in and of itself. In fact, many of the most desperate people in the world sometimes will use violence as a way of catharsis. That I may not be able to win, I may not be able to achieve, indeed I may have given up on my hopes, my dreams, my aspirations, I may not even be thinking of peace anymore, but at least I can hurt. At least I can make someone else cry. At least I can make them bleed. And unfortunately, this gets played out in multiple scenarios over and over. We've seen it now play out most powerfully in the war in Gaza, where there was no military objective truly for the slaughter that took place on October 7th, but it was a catharsis for those that were perpetrating it, because by the use of violence they could feel some way emboldened for what they had done. But the difference from that and the plagues or any of the other types of violence that we've already been discussing is that there was no ultimate goal of peace behind it. There was no ultimate goal of reconciliation. There was no ultimate goal of security for all involved. There was no aspiration of beating swords into plowshares. It was only to make someone else hurt. Violence is something that is very easy to give into, and the impulse to want to lash out when we feel powerless or when we feel embarrassed or when we feel just confused is very strong within humans. It is something that we all must wrestle with. But we can also recognize that in the right circumstance, with the right limitations, and for the right purpose, that indeed violence is sometimes necessary. And thank God those who are well trained in the IDF and those who command them are using violence on the unfortunate circumstance, but in the necessary ways in order to secure the security of Israel, and may it be also for the eventual peace and security of the Palestinian people, that they should not be under the disastrous rule of Hamas or any other of the terrorist organizations, and that they should be able to look towards eventually having hopes and dreams as well that do not involve violence, but involve peace for themselves and for the Israelis and all others. When we share that common goal, then we will find that indeed violence is no longer needed. Shabbat Shalom.